Hi everybody and welcome to the latest video in the series to accompany AQA Unit 2S, the making of modern Britain. And this video is going to look at the economic policies of the Thatcher government, focusing in particular on monetarism, privatisation, deregulation and also economic realignment. We're going to look first of all, at monetarism and a little bit of explanation about what monetarism actually means. So this was an economic theory which is becoming increasingly influential, particularly on the right, in the mid to late 1970s, and it was developed among others by the American economist Milton Friedman, and it was a theory that very much influenced Thatcher. Now, monetarism provided a very different approach to Keynesian economics. It was Keynesian economics that had been at the heart of the post-war consensus. The idea that in order to achieve economic growth, government should primarily be focused on the demand side of the economy, on managing demand, on levers such as income tax and interest rates. And Keynesian economics had been the dominant economic theory for the previous few decades. Monetarism says no, the most important principle is supply side economics. In other words, control of inflation through limiting the money supply, through controlling how much money is printed, is floating around in the economy, that is the primary aim of governments. Whereas for Keynesian economics, controlling unemployment and keeping unemployment low was potentially a key priority in a way that limiting inflation wasn't. For monetarists, controlling inflation took first place, and if that meant potentially that unemployment would increase, then many monetarists saw that as a price. Monetarists also very much focused on the importance of limiting government spending and government borrowing as well. And these are the sorts of ideas that Thatcher from the outset was determined to implement. And that's what she does. The interesting thing is that by 1980, a year in to Thatcher's government, unemployment has risen. That was perhaps not a surprise, to 2 million. What was for Thatcher very, very disappointing was that inflation had also grown, and it had grown to 15% as well. So for a monetarist who is really keen to bring inflation down, what we've got here is a return to the old bad days of stagflation, just like we'd seen under the Heath government, the worst of both possible worlds. The economy is stagnating, unemployment is rising, but inflation is rising as well. Now, fortunately for Britain and for Thatcher's government, North Sea oil is flowing, and we end up managing to avoid a serious balance of payments crisis. But nevertheless, the impact on ordinary people of the combination of rising unemployment and rising prices was clearly a very difficult one for many of the population. And it's no surprise that there was a lot of pressure on Thatcher's government, including from some of the so-called wets in Thatcher's cabinet, to reverse those monetarist policies, to return, almost like Heath had done, in the direction of consensus Keynesian economics. Thatcher, however, famously says, "You turn if you want to, ladies not for turning." And in 1981, actually, monetarist principles are extended even further. Government borrowing goes down and grants to local councils are reduced. That's something we'll talk more about in a minute. There's also a freeze in benefits. So Thatcher is determined, despite this rocky start, to continue pursuing this monetarist direction. Moving on now to monetarist views on taxation, Thatcher absolutely subscribed to the monetarist belief that, generally speaking, ordinary people spent money in a more efficient and sensible way than governments did. This was the idea that people will make sensible decisions about how to part with their hard-earned cash, whereas government tended to be wasteful. Monetarists would generally be very critical of what they called big government. And so Thatcher puts these principles into practice by focusing on the raising of indirect taxes, such as VAT, while also reducing direct taxes, particularly income tax. We can see this very clearly, the fact that by 1988, the top rate of income tax has fallen really very significantly, from 83 to 40%, and even the standard rate as well, going down from 33 to 25% between 1979 and 1988. At the same time, VAT and indirect tax on goods going up and almost doubling within that 1 year of 1979 from 8 to 15%. In addition to that, taxes on lots of goods like cigarettes, petrol, alcohol going up almost every year in an 8-year period between 1979 and 1987. And again, this is influenced by the fact that if you are somebody who is an ordinary person, you have a reasonable amount of money to spend, but you're going to think very carefully if on alcohol or cigarettes have gone up, and you're going to make sensible choices weighing up the fact that costs are rising. Whereas Thatcher would argue the government will never spend money as sensibly and as frugally as ordinary people, and as a result, therefore, direct taxes come down. And Thatcher said it's right to bring direct taxes down, it's right to bring income tax down, because people are far more likely to take risks, to innovate, to be entrepreneurs, to get involved in wealth creation, if they know that they can hang on to most of the money that they earn, if they know that the government isn't going to take most of that money off them in direct taxes. Far better instead to increase indirect taxes and allow ordinary people to make those choices and be efficient in their own spending when they're in a shop. Equally, though, Thatcher's opponents say no, raising VAT hits the poorest hardest, whereas income tax is a fair tax. Generally speaking, the more you earn, the more you pay. Indirect taxes like VAT are unfair because in the end, you go into a shop and you buy a pint of milk or a loaf of bread. Nobody asks you how much you earn. It is the same regardless of how rich or poor you are. And therefore, proportionately speaking, it hits the poorest hardest. So opponents of Thatcher very clear that raising indirect taxes while cutting direct taxes was going to harm the most vulnerable in society and only increase the gap between rich and poor. So like a lot of Thatcher's economic policies, these are controversial, very much polarising supporters and opponents. Moving on to one of the most significant aspects of Thatcher's monetarist policies now, and this is about the conflict between Thatcher and local councils. Because Thatcher reduced the grants to local councils, increasingly there was a huge amount of conflict between the government and these councils, many of which were run by Labour. Now, Thatcher had two problems with a lot of these Labour councils. First of all, she felt that many Labour councils, particularly in London, in Sheffield and Liverpool, were dominated not just by the left, but by the far left, or the loony left, as they were sometimes characterised by the tabloids. So on an ideological level, Thatcher was very suspicious of what she saw as far left councils with an ideology that verged, she felt, on Marxism. And equally, though, she felt Labour councils tended to waste money. They were the exact epitome of big government that she was opposed to. So Thatcher, for many reasons, was really very suspicious of a lot of local councils. Perhaps her most famous battle was with the old GLC, the Greater London Council, which was led at the time by Ken Livingstone, a very famous figure, quite an increasingly controversial figure, later to become the first directly elected mayor of London, but at the time the leader of the GLC. And he had put forward and introduced a lot of very left-wing policies, particularly around transport. There was a policy called Fares Fair on the London Underground, and in education as well. Thatcher felt that Livingstone and the GLC were being deliberately provocative. Equally, local councils felt that Thatcher was being provocative, particularly when she introduced rate capping. Now, we talked about rates in the previous video. They were the old method of funding local councils. And Thatcher basically said to local councils, we are going to cap the amount that you can set in the rates. We are going to make sure you can't tax local residents too heavily. And local council said, well, we need this money in order to properly fund local services. And in protest, we can see Sheffield and Liverpool councils in 1985 completely refusing to set any budgets at all. Ultimately, they back down under threat of bankruptcy, but this is a prominent and long-running battle and really exemplifies the conflict in the Thatcher years with local authorities. Thatcher decides in 1986 to introduce the Local Government Act, which is passed by Parliament, and this abolishes not only the GLC, but also some of the large metropolitan local authorities which had existed since the early 1970s. Now, Thatcher said this was the right thing to do. She viewed this layer of local government as a further layer of bureaucracy, as wasteful, but many of her opponents said, look, this is just central government in Westminster grabbing more power for itself, reducing any kind of local accountability. And they said, look, the principle of democracy works best where local councils are accountable to local people. If you take away a lot of local councils, if you reduce what existing local councils are able to do and spend money on, that accountability becomes very, very limited. And ultimately, is it right that we've got strong and powerful central government and increasingly weak local government? So once again, we've got real controversy here. What is interesting is that as a monetarist, Thatcher was absolutely clear that one of her big aims was to cut public spending. But she never actually achieves that. One of the main reasons for it is because unemployment is going up. We said it had already reached 2 million. We'll see that it gets to 3 million for some of the Thatcher era. And therefore, if unemployment's at 3 million, the amount that's being spent on benefits, on social security, is clearly going to rise. And it rises to the extent that even Nigel Lawson, a fully paid up Thatcherite, a real monetarist, one of the ultimate dries in Thatcher's cabinet, even he abandons his spending targets by 1986. So Thatcher, a great believer in monetarised ideas in principle, putting many of them into practice, but not necessarily seeing the benefits of monetarism that she's hoped for in terms of genuine cuts. Moving on to privatisation, this is a really significant aspect of the Thatcher agenda as well. And this is also a really important break with the post-war consensus. So, as we know, during the consensus, the mixed economy, a mixture of privately owned and publicly owned industry, was central. Whereas Thatcher says, no, privatisation should happen and we should continue to privatise more and more. And she starts, as she means to go on, with BP in 1979 being privatised. Not long afterwards, British Aerospace is privatised in 1980. The real height of privatisation comes in 1984 with BT, that's British Telecom, being sold off. It's followed by British Gas in 1986. And by 1986, the Thatcher government is really confident privatisation is a popular policy with the public. There's a massive advertising campaign where the public are really quite strongly encouraged to buy some of the shares in this newly privatised British Gas. So just like the sale of council houses, Thatcher is confident that this is another policy which is going to give ordinary people a bit more of a stake in the economy and therefore is going to be popular. And clearly, Thatcher's right to an extent. You can see that lots of people do become shareholders, often for the first time. The number of people who do own stocks and shares as individuals trebles from 3 to 9 million in the Thatcher years. And Thatcher is absolutely convinced that privatisation is the right thing. She is convinced that ultimately private companies are more efficient than the government when it comes to running industry, that private companies focused on profit ultimately will make efficiency savings in a way that state-run industry won't. And Thatcher says ultimately injecting competition into industry by privatising is going to encourage improvements, it's going to encourage money saving, and again it will encourage entrepreneurship, risk taking and innovation. Along similar lines, we also see what we call outsourcing. So this is where you get quite a lot of services which used to be fully run and delivered by local councils, things like bin collections, for example. Increasingly, private companies are being awarded contracts by the local council, and it is the private companies which are doing the day-to-day delivery of those services as well. Not surprisingly, both privatisation and outsourcing are controversial policies as well. A little bit more about privatisation. Obviously, Thatcher says, look, by selling off key industries, not only are we injecting greater efficiency, but we're also bringing in lots of revenue, lots of money for the government by selling those off, bringing the money in. But the critics of privatisation say, actually, look, these industries have been sold off far too quickly in this ideological rush to do it, and that actually they've been sold off far too cheaply. The government should actually have raised more revenue than they have done. Interestingly, Harold Macmillan, who of course was a Conservative, but perhaps the ultimate post-war consensus Prime Minister, Macmillan likens privatisation to selling off the family silver, very much along those lines. It's also the case that if you work in an industry that's just been privatised, some of you will find that you're made redundant as well. Other people who keep their jobs, nevertheless, find that their pension arrangements are far more limited than they had been previously. So in the rush to privatise and the consequent cost cutting and efficiency savings, it has an impact in terms of raising unemployment and also affecting people's pay packets sometimes and pensions as well. What is interesting as well in the Thatcher years is that Thatcher, although she's radical, is not the most radical Thatcherite. There are people around Thatcher who want to go further than she does. Lots of talk about privatising the railways. That doesn't happen till under John Major. Privatising the coal mines, privatising parts of the NHS as well. There are people around Thatcher who support all of this. Thatcher, although she's gone certain ways towards significant privatisation, still stops short of taking it to that extent. Nevertheless, if we're looking at what marks Thatcher out, there's still enough privatisation to say that this is definitely still a significant break with the post-war. Just like monetarism moved us a long way away from Keynesianism, so privatisation moved the country a long way away from the mixed economy. Moving on to deregulation as well, another really key Thatcher policy. Thatcher talked a lot about red tape, the idea that businesses were shackled by government rules and regulations. And so Thatcher removed quite a lot of those regulations from business. We call that deregulation, removing the regulations. And she says this will encourage businesses to grow, to trade more freely. And once again, it will encourage people to innovate, to create wealth, to drive the economy, to be entrepreneurs as well. And there are various aspects to this. First of all, it becomes a lot easier for small businesses to borrow money. There's a new loan guarantee scheme set up to enable that to happen. It's also possible, in theory, for people who are unemployed to borrow £40 a week for up to a year to help them if they want to try and set up a new firm. This is the new enterprise allowance scheme, which enables them to do that. So Thatcher is very keen to get these startup businesses growing and going as well. The other side of deregulation is what we call financial deregulation. And this is very much about the City of London, about the stock markets, where previously the Bank of England had really significant control, and Thatcher loosens those controls really very significantly on the banks and on the markets as well. The big moment in this comes in October 1986. And this is where a lot of the rules and regulations on London Stock Exchange and the City of London are removed. It's known as the Big Bang. And we get traders doing it via computer screens for the first time, far freer competition, a far greater role for foreign banks to be able to get involved on the London Stock Exchange and act as stockbrokers as well. Now, on the one hand, this really helps the City of London to become undoubtedly a world financial centre, up there, for example, with Wall Street in New York. And financial services increasingly becomes a big export industry for the UK. So it can be argued that this was a really significant step in that respect. On the other hand, there was quite a bit of criticism of Thatcher and this policy. People looked at some of those financiers who were taking risks and said, this is almost people becoming filthy rich. Some of the city financiers becoming increasingly wealthy. The word yuppie was coined to describe them as well. You often see them or saw them with the very early generation of massive mobile phones, for example, and filer faxes as well. So yuppies were a group of people who, on the one hand, were driving the financial markets, really strengthening the role of the City of London. But there were a lot of people, not just on the left, but more traditional conservatives, who looked at yuppies with a certain level of disdain. And there was a sense that Thatcher was encouraging a kind of wealth creation that was going too far, that some people were becoming super rich, and that this was seen as wrong. Now, just to summarise this as well, what we can say about Thatcher's time in office is there is some economic growth. What we don't see, though, is economic growth that's that different to the 1970s. There's a bit, but it's not massive. It's about 2.2% growth in GDP. Actually, when you compare that to the 70s, to what Thatcher saw as the bad old days of Heath, Wilson and Callaghan, actually that figure is pretty similar. What we also find is that productivity hardly goes up at all. So it's a pretty mixed picture when we're looking at economic growth. It's certainly not on the levels that Thatcher would have hoped for in comparison to the days of Heath. Moving on to a little bit more now about inflation. As we've said before, Thatcher believed that bringing inflation down should be the number one economic priority for government. She believed that inflation was more of an evil than unemployment, and like we've said, that unemployment going up was potentially a price worth paying if it meant inflation was controlled. Now, Thatcher was very keen to use interest rates as a lever to control inflation. We've seen this, of course, in the consensus years as well. We talked about this when we discussed stop-go policies. Obviously, bringing interest rates up. If you have a mortgage, for example, that will be more money going out to pay for that. It's ultimately a way that had been used for a long time, but Thatcher uses it really significantly. Interest rates go up to 17% in Thatcher's first year in office. Now, obviously, if interest rates go up, that means if you own a business, it becomes more expensive for you to borrow money. What it also means is the value of the pound goes up, and that has a knock-on effect on exports. British exports become less attractive. And so what we find is that demand for British goods goes down, output goes down as well, as businesses are struggling to borrow, and some businesses end up bankrupt and collapsing. Clearly, the effect of that is going to be another growth in unemployment. Now, as we said before, if that was happening and inflation was coming down, Thatcher might accept, well, okay, it's a price worth paying. But actually, inflation doesn't come down straight away. It's about 22% by 1980. Now, as the decade goes on, inflation does get under control. It goes right down to 2.5% in 1986. But what we find is that the government, in a desperate attempt to keep it at those levels, as that happens, ultimately, once again, businesses struggle to borrow, the value of the pound goes up, exports go down, output goes down, the economy is once again in recession. And so ultimately, the government accepts, look, if we're going to get out of this recession, then we are going to have to accept inflation rising again. And so we get inflation going up by 1990 to almost 11%. And the interesting thing again is that for all the new approach, for all the focus on monetarist policy, for all the deregulation and privatisation, a lot of this sounds remarkably similar to some of the things that we've discussed during the consensus years. The idea that governments can easily keep inflation under control and that there won't be a knock-on effect in terms of other economic indicators appears to be almost impossible. Certainly the story of at least some of the Thatcher years is that both inflation and unemployment are problems. With that in mind, a little bit more about unemployment. We've talked already about Thatcher's attitude to unemployment, and it's the north of England and the Midlands and parts of Scotland and South Wales as well, which really feel the impact of monetarist policies when it comes to rising unemployment. And the figures speak for themselves in terms of the way that a lot of traditional industry is really struggling. You can see in that third bullet point there, over just a 2-year period, overall manufacturing output is down by 15%. Production in the West Midlands, the Birmingham area, is down by a quarter. Steel production by 30%. And those unemployment figures as well, really quite shocking. By 1983, 13.5% of the workforce, 3 million, the highest total since 1945. Again, places in the north are particularly badly hit. Liverpool, one of the worst. At times during the 80s, the unemployment rate is almost 25% in Liverpool. Now, the government does attempt in some ways to deal with this. We get youth employment schemes where employers are given money and subsidies to take on younger workers being introduced. It's also the case that employers have to pay less in the Thatcher years in national insurance when it comes to lower paid jobs, so encouraging the creation of some of those lower paid jobs. But ultimately, this doesn't do loads to bring those unemployment figures down, and they remain above 3 million right the way through from 1983 to 1987. And an additional problem is that once people are unemployed, it's very difficult to get back into work, particularly because technology is moving on, industry is increasingly mechanised, and there is a move from manufacturing to service industries. So if you've worked in a traditional steel factory, for example, you then find yourself unemployed, getting back into work at a late stage feels almost impossible. And this leads us on to a wider trend, which is not something necessarily caused by the Thatcher government, but it's something that monetarist policies impact on, and it's something the Thatcher government really does embrace. And it is the move away from traditional manufacturing towards the growing surface industries. And so this means that, again, those traditional factories and mines and plants in the north increasingly are being squeezed and being closed down. What we also find at the same time is there's a growth in foreign competition, and like we said a moment ago, increasing computer technology, mechanisation. The whole landscape of the British economy is changing pretty rapidly in the 1980s, throw in the impact of monetarist policies as well, and it's a really difficult combination for traditional industry, whether shipbuilding, steel manufacture, mining as well. And a lot of working class communities find that everything that has bound them together is shattered. Local factories closing down, local trade unions becoming less powerful. And we also find, as a lot of the South does pretty well, a lot of the service industry is concentrated there, that the North-South divide, already pretty bad, increases. And it's no surprise that if you were to go to a northern inner city in the 80s, you would see grim things, an increase in alcoholism and drug use, especially among young people who, for the first time in generations, don't have an obvious career path into local industry. Growth in depression, in poor physical and mental health as well in those areas too. And it's no surprise that where people can, we get an increasing number moving away from those areas too. We said London and the South really growing as a focus of the economy and of the new service industries. And something quite shocking which came out later is that Geoffrey Howe, who is Thatcher's Chancellor in the early years of the Thatcher government, even says this process is inevitable, this is something we should accept, And places like Liverpool should be allowed, really, to decline until they're pretty much dead, in effect. The euphemistic phrase is managed decline, but it's a pretty hard line and pretty unpleasant philosophy. Interestingly, as we'll see, that's not shared by all members of Thatcher's cabinet. And Michael Heseltine, who's Thatcher's Environment Secretary, is somebody who argues against Geoffrey Howe. And he looks at the situation in the inner cities, he looks at places like the London Docklands and Liverpool, and says, actually, let's regenerate those places. And Michael Heseltine believes in this in principle, but he's also looked at what's gone on in the previous few years. And as you can see, one of the main things that's happened in the inner cities is rioting. The spring and summer of 1981, in particular, sees really very significant violence in Handsworth, in Birmingham, in Chapeltown, Leeds, in Toxteth, in Liverpool, and in Brixton, in South London. And a report is commissioned, and Lord Scarman reports back, and he says, look, these riots are caused by poverty, they're caused by unemployment, and they involve young Black and Asian men in particular who are rioting because they feel like they are treated unfairly. Lord Scarman refers to what were called the Seuss laws, where people were being stopped and searched by the police, and stopping and searching appeared to be particularly targeted at Black and Asian young people. An example is Operation Swamp, which has stopped about 1,000 people in less than a week in Brixton and London, the majority of whom were from the Black and Asian community. And Scarman said, look, clearly violence is not acceptable, but we need to understand why these riots are happening. And there are issues around the police and about potential racism, particularly in London, but it's about poverty and it's about unemployment as well. And it's interesting that even after the Seuss laws are repealed, you still get further riots in 1985 because poverty and unemployment was still really significant. And it's that, as well as principle, which leads Michael Heseltine to argue for regeneration. And as we said, he focuses in particular on Liverpool and the Albert Docks area there, which is transformed. He also focuses on the old London Docklands. And what we find as the 80s move into the 90s is that the old West India Docks in the East End of London are transformed, and we get the creation of Canary Wharf, which, after the City of London, is now the second biggest and most important financial district in the whole country. So Michael Heseltine manages to win the argument with Geoffrey Howe, but it's interesting as an illustration of the very different views, even within Thatcher's cabinet, to these processes of change and economic transformation and realignment that are going on.
A huge thank you to Tom there for another excellent video on modern British history. Remember, this is part of a playlist on modern British history 1951 through to 2007, designed for the AQA A-level history syllabus 2S. We will be adding more and more to this playlist to help you with your studies and prepare for the exams. Remember, there are also a range of other units which are covered in detail on this channel, including 1H, Tsarist and Communist Russia, as well as units on the Tudors and the American Civil War. Alongside the history coverage, there's also a huge number of videos on A-level politics, which obviously very closely links with the modern Britain unit. Thank you very much for watching. Please hit like to show your appreciation for Tom, and leave us any comments. If you haven't done so already, please do subscribe. Thank you again for watching.